Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday and happy early Thanksgiving. Thank you guys so much for coming today. I understand it's the day before Thanksgiving break starts. If you weren't here for the first 4 speaker events, my name is Tara, and I'm part of the team that works on the SCT Innovation Fellows Program, where you can complete a series of weekly challenges to get points and win prizes from the SCT.
Let me turn on the
And this semester, I'm running the Climate Challenge, where, as you may know, you come up with an idea for how to solve a climate problem in a particular area and present in front of a panel of judges next week, Wednesday. So today is our final speaker event as part of the Climate Challenge, and we're super excited to welcome Professor Alex Budak from our own Haas School of Business here at Berkeley. Alex has just released his new book, Becoming a Changemaker. So without further ado, I'll let Alex continue to introduce himself.
1 second, please. Jerry, thank you for muting yourself. Thank you.
We only need once.
What?
Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all here. Thanks for making the time on Thanksgiving week. I see a couple of friendly names, which is wonderful, including, I think, a former student and others. Looking forward to getting to know you as well. Since we've got a nice small group, we can kind of keep this flexible, interactive, and humble. But just briefly to introduce myself. So I wear a few different hats. I'm a social entrepreneur. I co-founded an organization called Start Some Good, which helps early stage social ventures get off the ground. I ran Scandinavia's leading social innovation incubator. And then through some really fortunate luck, I ended up at the Haas School of Business. And at Haas, I developed and teach the class called Becoming a Changemaker. It's a dream come true to be teaching the class. And it's also the subject of the book you see over my shoulder, which is called Becoming a Changemaker. It just came out. And I should say I'm a reluctant author. So I didn't set out to write the book, but I had enough students who came up to me after the class and talked about the influence that the class had on them and telling me it should be a book. And I ignored the first few students, but after enough, I thought, well, maybe there's something there. And so it's really because of the students, people like you, that I decided to write the book, all with the goal of helping people from all walks of life become change makers. So yeah. Tara, do you want me to take it from here, or do you have any questions?
Yeah, awesome. I think so. To everybody here, if you want to ask questions or if you have anything that you want to share, you feel free to unmute. If you feel like you're in a space that you're not comfortable or you're unable to unmute and speak, you can feel free to drop it in the chat. I will read it out for you. So I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. So yeah, definitely, this is very free and easy. If you want to unmute, go ahead and do so. But while we do sort of wait for questions to roll in or for people to unmute and think of questions, do you think you could tell us, maybe give us a little bit of a gist about what your class is like, what exactly being a change maker is, what the term means, and what really is in your book?
Yeah, those are great questions, Tara. I'm very happy to answer. But maybe before I do, since we've got a small enough group, I would love to hear from each of you. Could I put you each on the spot and could I ask you to just briefly introduce yourself and then also share a favorite change maker of yours? So when you hear the word change maker, who's someone that comes to mind, someone whom you admire? So happy to have them in the chat if you don't feel comfortable going off of mute, or if you do feel comfortable going off of mute, would love to hear from you. So just briefly, your name, what are you studying, and a change maker who inspires you. And then I will be happy to share my definition.
Hi, I can go first. I'm Lois, and I'm studying environmental economics and policy. And one of my favorite change makers is Phoebe Waller-Bridge. So she's an actress and a TV writer, and I don't know, for me, she is a change maker because the things she writes are things that people don't usually talk about, and she just writes in a very candid and expressive way, which I think a lot of people would appreciate. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll check out her work. Thanks for that. It was nice to meet you.
Thanks.
Mark, how about you?
So hi everyone, I'm Mark. I'm planning to graduate this semester, and my favorite changemaker used to be Elon Musk because he's building SpaceX to immigrate on Mars. But right now due to the Twitter scandal, I'm like not as favorite. He's not as favorable to me as he used to.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Whenever I'd ask this question among students, every single semester, someone would mention Elon Musk. But I'm so curious once I teach again in spring to see what that response is, because I teach a lot of leadership. And if you're curious, we could kind of explore Musk's leadership so far with Twitter, which I would say is not so good, and definitely against many of the principles I teach. Thanks for that. Yasmin, maybe you could share into the chat who a change maker inspires you. And then Jerry, would you be willing to share a change maker who inspires you?
Hi, I'm a retired pediatrician, and I guess the change maker would be my mentor, Iris Litt, who developed the field of adolescent medicine and went on to do a lot of things in women's gender studies.
Thank you, Jerry. Terrific. I love when I get to hear about and meet some new change makers. So Yasmin, welcome you to share into the chat if you're comfortable, since you're in the library. And Tara, I'll get to your questions now. So the way I define change making is radically inclusive. My definition of a change maker is simply someone who leads positive change from wherever they are. So you'll see in the definition that there's no mention of roles or of titles. I believe that a Nobel Prize winner has just as much claim to the title of change maker as an entry-level product manager. And I also think it's an inclusive identity. It's when we can layer on top of our existing ones. So you could be a changemaker pediatrician, you could be a changemaker author, you could be a changemaker entrepreneur, a changemaker scientist. It's a lens of seeing and understanding the world around us. And Tara, you mentioned about the book. So the book really follows the same structure as my class at Berkeley. So we begin with a changemaker mindset. That's your way of seeing the world around you and your ability to shape it. I've done some original research that looks at what are some of the traits that the most effective change makers have in common? Things like a sense of agency and curiosity and resilience that no matter your role, no matter your sector, the change makers need to have. From there, we go into change maker leadership. So it's about how can you inspire others to be part of change with you? How can you use vision to paint a picture of the future that's so compelling that people can't help but want to be part of it with you? And how can we look at some 21st century leadership trends? Things like how can you influence without formal authority to get things done? Because let's be honest, as a change maker, you often don't have a lot of formal authority. You've got to influence and inspire others to be part of changes with you. And then the third part is change maker action, looking at how do we take those challenging but crucial first steps of action? How can we learn from fields as diverse as engineering to art to understand, well, how do we put ourselves out there? And how can we get comfortable with taking those steps, even if we don't know exactly what will come, and the sort of courage behind it? I'm inspired by the words of poet Amanda Gorman. So you probably know her from her poem, The Hill We Climb, which she delivered at the inauguration of Biden and Harris. I think the final three lines are a great embodiment of what it means to be a change maker. She says, "For there is always light if we're brave enough to see it, and if we're brave enough to be it." For there's always light. It's the idea that tomorrow can always be better than today. Like, yes, let's recognize we do have real substantive systemic challenges we're facing, but also we can do something about it. And we can also be that light that illuminates the path forward for others. For there's always light if we're brave enough to see it. It's often, as a change maker, your opportunity to see things that others may not see yet, whether that's a status quo that needs to be disrupted or a system that's unjust and needs to be changed. And then if we're brave enough to be it, it takes courage. It takes a lot of courage often to be a change maker. We're going up against something called the status quo bias, which tells us that we tend to prefer the way things are. And so as a change maker, you've got to find that courage to take those first steps. It's never easy, but are you willing to be bold enough, to be brave enough to sort of stand up and say, yeah, I think another path is possible and don't have all the answers, but I'm going to give it a shot. So that's a way of thinking of being a change maker in the words of poetry. Maybe I'll just briefly read from Yasmin. She says, "My grandfather is a change maker for me. He came from the highlands of Peru, and though he had no economic resources, he promoted the development of his town and underrepresented communities by carrying out many activities that had a positive impact on the lives of many people." That's super inspiring, Yasmin. Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. So after this point, I can open up to other questions. Tara, I know you probably have many questions, but yeah, would welcome the chance to answer any questions that you may have, and we can really run a wide spectrum here. So We can talk about what it's like to be a social entrepreneur, since that's one hat that I wore. We can talk about sort of education and pedagogy. We can talk about the process of writing a book. It's a process that's kind of opaque. And one of my new passions is trying to elucidate that path forward for other new authors, something that I wish I had when I started. Or we can talk more about change making, talk about what does it take to lead positive change? How can you lead change from where you are? And of course, we can bring a climate lens to it as well. But yeah, Jen, I see your hand raised.
Thanks, Alex. So I have a bit of a controversial question, or maybe controversial, and it goes a little bit off of Mark's comment about Elon Musk. So we're talking about change making as a positive, but when you are going against the status quo, and you could argue that some of the developments in technology that maybe happened 10 to 15 years ago, we thought that it was going to be a positive change. And, you know, as things have gone on, you could argue maybe that it hasn't been positive. So how do you sort of reconcile that change maker aspect for the pros and the cons, and how you continue to evaluate over that time frame of becoming that change maker, you know, and the technology or whatever you're doing, whether it's technology or something else, sort of that path that when you have a vision of what you want that change to be, but you know, where that potentially diverges. Does that make sense?
It does, and I appreciate bringing that lens of technology in. So the way I think about it is that change itself is value neutral. It's a bit like technology in that way. Technology can be used for amazing positive ends and also for really terrible ends. And so to me, change itself is value neutral. But I think here I differentiate between a change agent and a change maker. So I think a change agent is someone who's a disruptor that changes things. But I do think that to have that title of a change maker, it does come with certain traits. One crucial one, I think, for instance, being empathy. So being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And I think often that's what differentiates someone who's a change agent from a true change maker. Now, of course, there's nuance, and of course, there's different ways that people will look at things. But in many of the technologies that we're looking at, I think oftentimes we sort of lose track of those end users, whether we think about, you know, for instance, Instagram, where there's terrible negative mental health implications, especially on teenage girls using the platform. I think that's a case where there's a powerful technology, but they aren't really putting themselves in the shoes of their users, or if they are, they're willing to put other priorities on top of that. So I think we need to look at change as being itself value neutral, but then think about how we can use it towards more positive aims through things like a change maker mindset and change maker leadership. The last thing I'll mention is I think we also need to think about change through the lens of systems. So it's rare that a quote takes my breath away, but this is what happened when I read a quote from Paul Batalden, who's a medical doctor. He says, every system is perfectly designed to give the results it delivers. So put another way, if you keep getting the same results, it's not that you have to change the inputs, you have to change the system itself. And so as change makers, we're often working within systems, and those can have really negative outcomes. You know, I think, for instance, in my own change maker journey, one of the challenges that we faced is we raised venture capital money for Start Some Good, but it turned out that we weren't really mission aligned with the VC that we raised funds from. Now, I think in Silicon Valley, you often tend to celebrate as soon as you get VC funding. It's like, oh yeah, you made it. But actually, we found ourselves then in a system which didn't really work. In the case of Start Some Good, we are a for-profit, we're a benefit corporation. But as we thought about our impact model, we said, well, we'll only have an impact model and revenue model that are completely hand in hand. And what we started seeing was that there was tension to sort of pull away from that, to sort of find other ways to generate revenue, which is kind of the world of VC. And again, it's not a judgment necessarily, other than that was taking us off path. It was a different system than the one we wanted to be part of. So I think we need to be very cognizant of the systems that we're working in. And then also as change makers, have that lens towards how may we shift those systems? How do we change those systems towards more just and equitable aims as well?
That's awesome. That's super insightful. Actually, kind of bouncing off of that, I did have a question. So, of course, all of us mostly being at Berkeley and being involved with the SCET were primarily students. And of course, education is a system that we've all sort of been raised in for close to 16 years by the time we graduate, where we're kind of just taught to sort of listen to a professor or to listen to a teacher in grade school, in high school, in college, and sort of study, learn, accept it, and then spit it out on an exam. How do you think going from that sort of a system, that sort of environment into, I guess, the real world, in a sense, in a very different sort of environment, how do you think students should sort of stay as change makers or become change makers as they make that transition? And what skills do you think are transferable from this sort of system of education to the real world when students are thinking about becoming change makers?
Love that question. And I think often our education systems aren't preparing us to be change makers. They're preparing us to be really good at telling us what we're told to do. One of the biggest shifts you'll need to make is that there's no syllabus for change making. There's my class, of course, but in the real world, when you try to lead change, there's no syllabus, there's no assigned readings, there's no steps to take. You've got to figure it out. And so one of the things we need to do, I think, as educators is do a better job of developing in our students a sense of agency, the sense that you don't need someone else to tell you exactly what to do, that you find that strength within yourself. Now, as an example, in my class, I have something that's become known as the failure exercise. So we spend an entire week talking about failure. We learn some case studies, we look at some empirical research and data, we do some frameworks. But then towards the end of class, I simply put up a slide which has 2 words. It says, go fail. And my students kind of look at me like, what's going on? What is he talking about? And then I put up the next slide where they know I'm for real. And I say, okay, you have 15 minutes. You have to go leave the classroom and you have to go get rejected on purpose. You cannot come back to the class until you've asked for something and gotten a no. Now, if you're like my students, you probably feel really uncomfortable with this. I see that students start turning a little bit red. They start sweating a little bit. They tell me afterwards that their hearts are beating faster. It's really scary because so often in the higher education system, we're sort of told what to do. And as long as you follow the right steps, kind of say yes, do the right things, and you'll succeed, you'll get good grades. And this flips it, because as a change maker, one of the most important things you can do is get comfortable with failure. There's never been any change anyone has led that didn't require overcoming a lot of failure along the way. So students leave the classroom really nervously, they shuffle out, and then 15 minutes later, they come back and the energy is completely off the charts. So much so that I once had a Haas faculty member right next door come over and ask us to keep the noise down because students are just so lit up for this experience. And we find that one of 2 things happens. We find that about 1/3 of students, they ask for something, sure, they'll be rejected, and they actually get a yes. The person says, yeah. I think about a student who went downstairs to the Haas cafe and she asked for a free orange juice. And the barista said, yeah, okay. And she went, okay, can I have 2? And he said, yeah, okay. 3? And fortunately, he cut her off there, but she came back with 2 orange juices for the class. And so, of course, the lesson there is that so often our first failure is we don't ask for what we actually want. We're so sure we'll be rejected that we don't put ourselves out there. And then for the other about 2/3 of students who do get a rejection, they realize that failure isn't fatal, that no one laughed at them. And they often come back with a bit more confidence because they're proud of themselves for having put themselves out there. And they realize, well, okay, if I could ask for this thing, which is silly, like, a woman who asked an older woman, could I borrow your shoes and wear them? Right? It's a weird ask, but she comes back with a little bit more confidence and says, look, if I can ask for that, I can ask for things I really care about going forward. And so in my class, I really try to change students' mindset, change their perspective, to realize that there is no syllabus when it comes to leading change. I think one of the other challenges that many students, I think especially at Berkeley, face is just the intense pressure you all have around grades. I really feel for you because it's such an intense atmosphere. And I'll just share from my own perspective as a faculty. I think the most learning that happened in my class was during COVID, when there were no grades, when it was basically all pass, no pass. And I really feel like when students took away the pressure of grades and were just totally engaged in the material, the learning was far better. And so it's a funny thing because I know that grades matter. If you want to get into grad school, if you want to get prestigious jobs, grades matter. But the bottom line is once you get into the working world, no one's going to give you a grade. And in change making, you don't get a B+ or an A-, you just get things done. And so shifting from that sort of extrinsic sense of motivation, someone else telling you you did a good job, to that more intrinsic sense, I think is a crucial shift that we all need to make as change makers.
Yeah, actually, going off of that sort of topic of talking about failure, that really made me think about a lot of the things that we've heard in the past on entrepreneurship. Different speakers have mentioned this, and other things that we've heard from people at the SCET in other events is that failure is something to get very comfortable with in entrepreneurship in general, not just with not just with regards to change making. But I was wondering, in terms of change making specifically, would you say that failure is always a good thing, or would you say there are different types of failure? Or is there situations in which you would say failure can be negative or positive? How would you distinguish that?
One of the wonderful things about being a change maker is you realize you have so much control over your mindset. So a failure in and of itself is not good or bad, perhaps leaning towards bad, but it's what you do with that failure that makes the difference. And so a good failure is where you fail and you learn something from it. And so it's creating a deliberate practice where you can focus on not just did I fail, but what did I learn from it? And so in teams that I lead, we like to start each week in our weekly meeting asking 2 questions. What was your win of the week? What's the thing you did that moved us closer to our goals? And how did you fail this week? And what did you learn from it? And what we do there is that we first normalize failure. So everyone's expected to fail, but also we create a learning mindset out of it, which is that with almost any failure, if you just repeat that failure over and over and over, well, then it's not a good failure and you haven't grown from it. But if you can learn about that failure, you can share those lessons with others, huge growth comes from it. So yeah, I think it's all about what do we do? Look, you can't control whether or not you will fail. You will all fail sometime this week. And so my challenge to you is how do you process that failure? And how do you take a bit of time to understand what happened? And how do you move forward differently as a result?
That's a really interesting insight. Thank you. I think Lewis has a question. Would you like to unmute?
Hi, yeah. Going for like a different topic for a bit. You were talking about change maker leadership and how you can influence with formal authority. And I noticed that in bigger environments, it's much more difficult to be a leader, or when there are so many people to lead from different backgrounds with different ideas. How are you able to navigate that, and how are you able to make people participate when they're all different from you and all different from each other?
Thank you. It's a thoughtful question. I deeply appreciate it. And so first is, of course, recognizing there's huge power in diversity and that we're all so much better when people bring their own different experiences, backgrounds, lived experiences all together. So it's perhaps harder, but so important to be able to lead. But the framework I've developed, which I read about in the book, is called the 3 V's. This is a way that you can lead others. And so the 3 V's are vision, values, and victories. So vision, one of the most important jobs you have as a change maker, I think, is to paint that picture. Paint that picture of where you're headed. You don't have to know exactly how you'll get there, but give people that sort of future state, whether that's a reduction in climate, a healthier world, new technology, whatever it is, kind of paint that picture. And then crucially, help people see how their contributions, however small, however tangential, connect to that larger vision. So your job is to paint that picture. And then in some ways you can almost delegate to them to sort of say, look, this is where we're headed. Let's figure out how you can play a role in getting us towards that goal. Secondly, values. So giving people a way of working, something that unites them. I'm a big fan, for instance, those of you that are students at Haas, we have our defining leadership principles. Those really resonate with me, but have a set of values, because as a leader, there will be so many decisions that you need to take on the team that you can't be involved in all of them. But if you can define those values for people, they'll have this roadmap to understand how they make those values. For instance, do you value bold risk-taking, or do you value being sort of more conservative? Do you value radical inclusion, or do you value sort of traditional expertise? With values, there's not really right or wrong answers, but your job as a leader is to set those values, give people a way of working, and ideally something that connects them to a greater sense of purpose. And then the third thing is victories. One of the things that I've found in working with change makers around the world is that we're so driven, so passionate, and especially on something like climate, where it's this big, complex challenge, the challenge of our lifetime, it can feel really overwhelming. And many of us will probably be committed to our changes for the rest of our life, but not everyone will be. And so part of what is, I think, important as a change maker leader is to celebrate those small wins. Of course, we want to get to deep systemic change to reduce CO2 and big changes. But also, let's celebrate the small wins along the way. Make people feel like they are being seen for the hard work that they're putting in. Celebrate those wins, especially when those wins lead us to a larger goal. So that's my suggestion there is the 3 V's. So lead with vision, with values, and celebrate victories.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. Good question. Time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, I think.
Word.
Yasmin, do you want to put any questions in the chat? So while we're waiting to see if anybody else has any questions, Alex, maybe any thoughts on, because I know that we have a small group here, but this is being recorded, so we'll be sharing this with everybody that has registered for the climate challenge. Any thoughts about the Changemaker principles from the standpoint of a climate challenge and advice that you would give the students?
I think one of the biggest things, and this is credit to one of my guest speakers I had in my class, a student asked him, and by the way, this is Sid Espinoza. He is the first ever Latino mayor of Palo Alto, California, and at the time was VP of philanthropy at Microsoft. And so a student asked him a question like, hey, I want to lead change in climate, but it feels totally overwhelming to me. What advice do you have? And his advice has really stuck with me, as I think with many of my students. He said, we've got to stop seeing change as an individual sprint. Instead, we've got to start seeing it as a relay race. That our job is to pick up the baton from those that came before us, especially on something like climate, where we won't solve it in our lifetimes. Our job is to take that baton and advance it as much as we possibly can, whether that's in 5 years, 20 years, 40 years, 60 years that we work on it. And then when the time comes for us to hand off that baton to the next generation, but don't just hand it off, make sure you set them up for success through mentoring, through advising, through guiding, and make sure that they can carry it forward. And I think the world looks a lot different, especially when it comes to deep systemic challenges like climate, when instead of trying to do it all ourselves and putting that pressure on ourselves that we have to do it, to instead think about how can I be part of that relay team and how can I do as much as I can in the time that I have, and then know that others will then take the baton forward when their time comes.
Awesome. I think Yasmin had a question in the chat. How to overcome the imposter syndrome in the change-making journey?
Yeah, good question. And unfortunately, it's something that I think we all feel. I certainly felt it a lot in writing my book. I think Berkeley breeds a lot of imposter syndrome. And so I think the first thing is to give yourself the permission to know that you're not the only one that feels it, that nearly everyone feels it. And there's a terrific article in Harvard Business Review, which is called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, which makes a really compelling case that feeling imposter syndrome is not a problem with you. It's a systemic problem. It's that organizations and places haven't done enough to make you feel like you belong. So you're feeling it, stop blaming yourself. But if you do start feeling it, I think my biggest suggestion is to focus on some of those small wins. General McRaven, he's the general who oversaw the raid that ended up killing Osama bin Laden. He gave a talk at University of Texas at their commencement, and he had one piece of advice for them. What would this general say who could give any piece of advice? He said, make your bed. Make your bed. He says that start with those small wins. Build that little bit of consistency, that little bit of traction, like get that small win on the board. And he says, if you come back at the end of the day, and even if the day was bad, well, at least you come back and your bed is made. And so I think apply that to your own context and think about, take the pressure off yourself if you do feel imposter syndrome. But if you do, just try to get some small wins and remember that each win builds upon itself, and that will build confidence for you to remember that you do absolutely deserve to be here.
Thank you. I think that's definitely super helpful. Lois, you have another question?
Yeah. Kind of bouncing off of that, because currently we're doing the SCET Climate Challenge, and it's kind of a big task, especially because a lot of us aren't really experts on the topic, and we haven't been like studying a specific topic for years. And sometimes it's really difficult to know where to start and which problem to solve, how to go about solving it, when you don't really have so much knowledge on the topic. And I know that I think mentioned earlier that change makers have a vision. But what if you don't really have a specific vision yet, but you know that you do want to make some change?
Totally, and that's totally fine. And I think it's a great opportunity for you to start thinking about those visions. And there's often a lot of pressure to think you have to have everything all sorted out right away. But sometimes it's just an inkling or a sense of something you want to explore a little bit. My friend Jocelyn Ling Milan, she has wonderful advice. And she says to think about your career as a series of hypotheses that you can't possibly know exactly what you want to do, especially at age 20, 21, 22. But instead, come up with hypotheses and things you may want to test. And so your hypothesis might be, do I like working in climate? Do I think that the best solutions to climate are community-based or technology-based? Do I want to work in a big company, or do I want to start my own thing? These are all examples of questions you could ask yourself, and there's no right or wrong answer. But come up with your own hypotheses and then go test them. Let's say that you do have an inkling and you say, maybe I want to be an entrepreneur. Well, there's no better way to figure out if you want to be an entrepreneur than to go do it. And so try it out for a few months, see what you think. And then if it works, great. And if not, it's not a failure. You just learned that, well, it's not something that resonates with me. I'll try something else. And so I think thinking in terms of hypotheses can be really powerful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I'll just add one more thing to that, if I may. So Lois, one way that you can think about your challenge is to think about everyday things that are in your life. So for instance, if you ride a bike, or if you have, particular shoes, or something that you can actually make that you use that could make it carbon negative. Think about something that is maybe part of your everyday life as well, that is more tangible, that might make it more relevant to how you're living your life, because this challenge is very broad-based, right? You don't need, the purpose of it is for everybody to think about how they can be a change maker within the climate world. So it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in any one particular thing. It's being insightful about what you think might be able to work. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm.
And we can always talk offline as well. I know Tara has office hours, and you can feel free to reach out to me as well if you want to talk more.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great question. I'm sorry, at this point, I need to go join my family. We've got kind of an early Thanksgiving going on, and probably many of you also have some travel plans as well. Tara, I'll send it back to you to wrap up, but also just say, I love connecting with changemakers. So I'll put my LinkedIn into the chat. You're very welcome to connect with me there, because I would love to keep in touch with you and see how I might be able to support you on your own climate changemaker journey.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex. It was really great to hear everything you have to say about being a change maker. I think it was really insightful for a lot of us, especially since it may not be something that many of us have experience with or have taken your class before. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, especially it being right before Thanksgiving, to join us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great Thanksgiving break, everybody.
Thank you.